Alright, so guys, welcome to our first workshop of the semester. Today we're going over fundamentals, which is just some good practices for studying art and good artist mindset. Today we're being hosted, or this workshop's being hosted by Winnie, and I'll sprinkle in a few tidbits here and there as well. So here are some goals we have with the workshop. Overall, we're just going to try to very briefly go over fundamentals and mainly give you pointers to what things you can use to help you practice. So first, why we study art, how to create, or just like what it means to study with a plan, and go into more specifics with each fundamental. And then at the very end, we'll give you some time to do a little exercise focusing on one of those fundamentals. So yeah, studying art is basically looking at anything. It doesn't have to be something that exists like in the world. It could be the work of another artist, and being inspired to make something from that, whether that be tracing, recreating, etc. It's especially about noting when you look up a piece of art. So, creating a plan, a lot of the times you're going to be asking yourself um, figuring out why certain things are appealing to you. Like, why does this particular line lead the eye, or how does this color create contrast, or how does like create a convincing but also like a dynamic lighting situation. Those are all things that you can look for when you are looking at other artists' work. Yeah. And then one more just like thing about when it comes to studying, balance is really key if you want to prevent yourself from getting locked into um, like an art blog period. You gotta make sure at least 30% of the time you're having fun. So a lot of the times, a lot of professionals will just like uh, break their chunks of work into different pieces. Like in a 30-minute increment, I'll like focus on this one technical thing that I really don't want to do, and then another 30-minute increment, be like, okay, I'll do this one part that I'm actually kind of interested in, and then the last one, you can like, like you don't have to constantly be in like a flow state if you can't find it. At least 30% of the time, make sure you're having some kind of fun with what you're practicing. So, yeah.
Really important to not just draw something maybe are more appealing to some, but also like maybe just do a silly doodle, just have a bit of fun doing art because hopefully you start art because it's fun, you like it, and remembering why that is really important for maintaining artistic creative energy and um, motivating yourselves to continue to study art because they like it. Right, so moving on to the first fundamental that we're covering, value. And this is basically light to dark, white, gray, black. Um, One of the most basic exercises that you'll get in like art classes is doing this like value scale going from white to black in these little increments, and it really teaches you like it's really simple, but if you do it traditionally, it's a lot harder than you think. Um, to try to get the right shade to progress to the black. Um, and then something I would recommend for value studies is just getting a random picture. For example, these pictures are of nature scenes. This one's like, I didn't have the picture, but it was the sky with some flowers in the front. And just taking that picture, walking in the biggest values. So like with the flowers, I just blocked it out with a white uh, here, and then with the background with clouds, and also with darker shapes. And having these big blocks of color, like in the picture, is a lot more complex. There's a lot more different shades, different values, but just simplifying it to these three values here really helps you simplify the piece so that it's more clearly readable. So I put here squint your eyes as the last point because it's a really important point. It's really important that you squint your eyes when doing value studies, especially because when you squint your eyes, it's kind of your eyes just kind of blur out everything, and it makes you focus on either the brightest or the darkest values, and that can help you figure out, okay, this is how I'm going to simplify everything. Same thing here. If you squint your eyes, you'll see probably like the darkest blocks of color will be these dark tree trunks, and then you'll also probably see the lightest part, which is this little random white swiggle here. So yeah, definitely squint your eyes when you're doing value studies. But value studies really teach you a lot about how to create contrast between different values. Like, if you put darker values against lighter values, then it's going to be a very like distinct line between them. And that can draw your eye to those areas. So like when we're looking at this study, our eye is instantly drawn to the flowers because they have the most contrast against the darker background. Okay, and then these are just some more value studies. In the previous slide, I used just 3 values, and then in these have a lot more values in them. So as you do more value studies, you get a bit of a hang of it and go from simple shapes to a bit more complex shapes by rendering out your big blocks of values with more detail with other values. It also teaches you things about hemispheric perspective, which is when things get lighter, the further in the background you go. So for example, with this study, if you ever look at pictures of mountains or just like a city street, you'll notice like everything in the back will get a lot lighter in value, and also the details are a little bit more fuzzy, or you can't really tell the details at all. So doing value studies will help you get the hang of that as well. And then eventually you can just make value like landscapes out of your mind, which is what I was doing here. Okay, so another important concept, I kind of was hinting at it, but value grouping is something to keep in mind when you're doing any sort of illustration or just working with a lot of different values, to make sure that whatever you're working on is really like readable and clear to viewers. It's really like helpful to group all your values together. So for example, in this tutorial by Celestial Fang, they grouped all their dark values at the bottom half here and also in these upper corners. And then their lightest values are all in the center here. So immediately when we look at this, our eyes are directly drawn to the center. Not only just because the figure is in the center, but also because like the lightest values are here. And then the figure, which is also light in value, is surrounded by a little bit of a darker value. So that creates value contrast, and so that draws our eyes there. And then same concepts for all of these other parts of the tutorial. Value grouping can make things a lot clearer for the viewer. And even when you have a whole bunch of colors, like these two faces here, even if you like squint your eyes, they're still pretty readable. So I always say squint your eyes when you're looking at things, because it'll help you realize, oh, I need to make these values lighter, these values darker, things like that. Right. Oh, yeah, yeah. Yeah, one thing on that, I know like things like the splash art for League of Legends, like characters, they are awesome to look at because there's really great value grouping in them. The artist really makes sure that there's, one part of the illustration is lighter and one part of the illustration is darker. They're really good at keeping things clear for the viewer. Another thing I wanted to mention before we continue is that a lot of the resources that I share in this in this PowerPoint will be sent in the chat at the very end. So I'll have all of the links to things like this tutorial and the other stuff that we'll be going through for your guys's access. All right, moving on, some example value grouping. So for this artwork, if you screen your eyes again, you'll easily see like the orange in the artwork is like much lighter in value. So it's the lightest values, and then the blue is the mid-tone, and then the clothes here are the darkest in value. So there's very clear value grouping, and Megumi's figure in the front, he really stands out because of the darker values against the mid-tones, and then what was I saying? Yeah, and it's just very cohesive. We get a really good general idea of the shapes, and even though the bunnies are like, there's a lot of details going on, but even then, like because they're all kind of similar in value within the clouds and the bunnies, they are all grouped together, and so that's why it's very readable. One thing I will say is, sorry guys, I'm sick, so I've got a little bit of like, I'll probably be clearing my throat and all that for a while, but excuse that. Also, I wanted to add that Toji's figure in the back, his clothes are a little bit closer in value to the mid-tones of the blue bunny clouds. Like even though his pants are a bit darker in value, so they stand out pretty well, his white shirt, it kind of blends into the mid-tones. So that's what I mean about clarity, visual clarity, because there's not as much of a contrast. Even though there's like these orange highlights, it still kind of blends into the clouds. So there's also that. And then in this photo and this artwork, we have the window light. And that's probably the first thing that you'll see in the piece because it's just the highest amount of contrast in the piece is like this very light value against all these other values. So yeah. All right, we're moving finally on to color. Color and light, basically. So let's go through some color theory terms that are really important. Color theory is a term that's tossed around a lot, and I feel that these are the most important three concepts to understand with color theory and trying to do studies on it. So for one, just understanding the difference between hue, saturation, and value. Hue is just the different colors you have. So yellow, orange, red, those are all different hues. Simple enough. Saturation is how intense a color is. So, the most saturated red is the reddest red there is, and then the least saturated or the most desaturated red is like a gray. And then we already went over value. So this is the reason why I put color after value, is because value really helps you understand lights to darks. But once you get into color, we're adding hue and saturation into the mix. So it gets a lot more complicated. So it's really good to start with doing value studies and then moving to color, in my opinion. And then another concept is understanding the difference between warm versus cool colors. So if we start with this color wheel, usually if you think of warm colors, you'll think, red, orange, yellow. And that makes sense. It's like it reminds us of heat, of day, of summer, those kinds of colors. And then the cool colors will be purple, blue, green. But every color, every hue has a warm and cool version of themselves. So, sorry, it might be a little bit small on the screen, but here we have like these reds. There's the warm version and the cool version of the red. And then cool version and warm version of blue. Same thing for every other color. And that's really important to understand because you can create a lot of mood with just deciding on whether you're using a warm or cool color. And you also create contrast if you're using a cool color against a warm color. All right, and then the third set that I want to talk about is just color schemes in general. Sorry. Well, first of all, we have monochromatic, which is when you're only using one color. And then when you're using analogous color, that means it's just colors next to each other. So orange and yellow, or blue and purple. Complementary is colors on the opposite side of the wheel. So purple and yellow, blue and orange, green and red. And complementary colors are really important to understand because they create the most contrast when they're next to each other. And also, when you mix them together, like you're traditionally mixing them, like as paints, or if you're mixing them digitally, they will desaturate each other and create a more neutral version of each other, or like something closer to gray when you mix them with each other. And then analogous colors, I really like using analogous colors in my own work just because they're really simple. They harmonize with each other really well. Like, for example, if we're going back to this one, this piece here, we have like orange and reds and yellows. Like, it's all complementary colors, and so it harmonizes pretty well. Meanwhile, we have orange and blue in this one, so it's direct analogous colors. Sorry, I always mix up analogous and complementary. It's direct complementary colors. Sorry, orange and blue. So it creates a lot of contrast. Okay, so before I move on, there's also other color schemes like triadic, which is when you're forming a triangle on the wheel. Split complementary, which is complementary colors, except the colors also next to them. And then tetradic, which is making a rectangle. There are like a whole bunch of different types of color schemes, but these are the most basic ones. All right. Color relativity is also a very important concept to understand because every color is relative. And what I mean by that is depending on what color you have next to each other, they'll look different. So, for example, this blue and this blue look different. Like this one looks darker in value and this one looks lighter in value based on the colors that they're surrounded by. And then, this purple looks less saturated than this purple, so it looks like more desaturated, and then this will look, it's just very dependent on the colors that are around it. Same thing for hue. And then we'll get into this tomato in a second. Let me just go over, actually, never mind. Let me go over this tomato right now. So just going over the terms that we talked about, this red is the most saturated, and then it gets a little bit desaturated in the other parts of the tomato. And then you have a really saturated purple here, and then less desaturated but darker value purple here. So you can really, if you just study like a tomato, right, you can get a whole bunch of like the value, saturation, and hue concepts just running and understanding how those work together to create a really like colorful and cohesive piece like this. And then I'll leave it to Veronica to cover this slide.
Okay, cool. So are you able to hear me okay, by the way?
Yeah.
Cool. So, like Winnie was saying, color relativity is a huge, huge part of studying light. And those two topics coincide when you're doing your studies. One thing I will say, collecting your reference is super, super important, and it's very important that you try to keep that, like keep your subject matter varied. What I mean by that is picking like between still life objects or like looking at painters, especially plein air painters who they like paint outdoors and are like directly observing their environment and stuff like that. They have an incredible understanding of light, and then like also choosing different environments. So that's like kind of what I tried to provide with the spread of studies I have here. when you're picking your objects, don't don't pick anything like wildly complex, I would say, if you're just starting out. And even if you're not just starting out, studying something as simple as an egg is really hard to do. And like capturing all the little nuances of it can prove to be a challenge. So your objects don't necessarily have to be super complex for you to make all sorts of really interesting observations about how light plays in your scene. Um, Another thing about reference, there are good pictures and just like artworks to choose from. Generally, when you're picking photo reference, um, getting or say you're taking photo reference, you should try to look for scenes that have more of a dynamic lighting setup. And by that I mean you should be able to distinguish the object from the background pretty easily. So like there's some kind of backlighting that forms a rim around your object to keep it from the background. Key and a fill, even if it's subtle, like with the egg study, like there's still a lot going on there, and I can tell what the object is. It's not like flatly lit against like a bright white table, you know what I mean? So those are things to keep in mind when it comes to picking out your reference. When you're actually studying, though, again, like keep it really simple. You can, and this goes for digital painting. Keep one brush for painting, one for blending, and then keep everything on one layer. Like it's so easy to get caught up in the details of everything. But since these are color studies and we're really looking at how light interacts with different objects and how it reflects off of other things, like portraying accurate form is not really the goal. Really, you're just trying to see how different, how hue, saturation, and value vary relative to one another. So yeah, pay attention to your grays. Never underestimate your grays. And while it like completely defeats the purpose of the study if you're using the eyedropper directly on your reference, you can definitely do that on your own. Like do it on your own drawing. Like that would make a lot of sense for you to like move your color picker slightly left, slightly right, and constantly making really quick adjustments as it relates to whatever local color that you're using or whatever. So yeah, those are my tips. I will say if you're color relativity, if you're looking to study like that specifically, really looking at like plein air painters is really, really helpful. Like even though this particular scene in the middle probably wasn't that yellow, you can see it works. It's really helpful for color harmony. So yeah, I think yeah, it's not perfect. Like none of the shapes here are really perfect. I'm just trying to get just trying to see how light works.
Yeah, it's a study, and you gotta just adapt your study to whatever you want to learn, which leads me to my next slide. I won't be going too in depth into it, but this tutorial by Ping Up Penguins, which I'll also be linking later, it really tells you a lot about. It teaches you a lot about how to study color when you're studying from a photo, but it can also apply if you're studying from life as well. Like these studies on the left are not exact 100% like reproductions of the pictures on the right, but like the artist did what they wanted to get out of the study. Like they made some colors more cool or more darker in value to exaggerate the certain parts, and then simplifying other parts. So really, studies don't have to be too complex or difficult, or it doesn't have to be crazy, like realistic. Do what you need to learn out of the study. And then another resource, or another sort of way to practice color studies instead of just looking at pictures, is also making like a day and night version of one like drawing. So for example, for Jenny Lee's artworks, she did like a day and night version of like this room here. You can see she used like warm colors, pink and orange and all that up here, and then she uses like these cooler purples in the perimeter of the art, and then towards the center where we have the light, we have more warm colors. And this is what I meant earlier by like creating contrast when you're using warm versus cool colors. We're drawn here instantly, not only because it's lighter in value, but also because of the warm warm yellow that's opposite of the cool purple, which, by the way, yellow and purple complementary colors. Woo! So yeah, I like to really look at what colors are the artist using to create this effect of like this moody night version versus like a more day version. And the same thing here with Holly Chu's work. The colors that she used versus in the day version versus the night version, like again, we have warmer yellow colors in one area of the piece with light, and then around it we have cooler colors that are a bit darker in value as well. And even this like this yellow top of this store, it's actually more closer to green and it's cooler. So yeah, just looking at how the choice in colors you make can really affect how a piece looks is really important to understand whether you're looking at a piece or also doing it yourself. And then this is just a resource by Angela Song. They're actually a plein air painter as well that I would really recommend you guys studying from if you want to study from plein air artists. But they made these digital like background pieces with just line art alone. So if you wanted to practice coloring them, doing like a day versus night version, or just doing what you want, you can look at those as well. Okay, moving on to perspective.
Okay. So the thing with perspective is that I think a lot of people sort of like forget about it. Storyboard artists, like layout and background artists, all have a really great understanding of perspective, and especially background artists, like that's a huge thing. If you're trying to like make a whole cityscape or something, it would look really off if all the angles of your buildings look kind of wonky. So that can quickly go downhill if you don't understand perspective. So what is it exactly? You probably already know what it is, sort of like intuitively. It's a way of defining the physical space, so like how vast or cramped something is, but it's also really important for conveying character or audience viewpoint. So a lot of times, like from a storytelling perspective, some questions that the perspective can inadvertently put forward are like, are we witnessing like a defining moment in our protagonist's arc? Maybe we're snooping on someone in the midground, or maybe like there's something dangerous approaching our character that like the audience can see but like they can't. So it's really important for like framing devices, emphasizing what's the focal point in the scene, and establishing sort of like a hierarchy of importance when you have a bunch of objects set before you. So there you go.
Just to cover 1, 2, 3 point perspective, it's, if you don't already know, it's based on how many points you have on the horizon line of a piece, which we'll get to in a second, like what the horizon line is. But yeah, the horizon line, we have 1 point here, so it's 1 per perspective. Every line converges to this 1 point. like the streets and the roofs. And then for 2-point, we have 2 points on the horizon line that they all converge to. And then 3-point is when we have 2 points on the horizon line and then 1 point away from it. I want to go over an example, and this is a screen capture from Into the Spider-Verse. We have a gorgeous like horizon line scene here where we see the horizon lines here, and then if we just mark that there, then we can also figure out where the vanishing point is. This is a pretty central shot, so it's very easy to find, but if we find out where all the lines converge, they all go towards the center. So that's where our vanishing point is. If you can't directly see the horizon line as easily, then again, you're just finding all the converging lines and figuring out where they're connecting to. So we can estimate that they're converging around here. And then for that point, then we just make a horizontal line and we'll find out where the horizon line is. Pretty simple. So when you're doing studies for perspective, I think that it's really important to just figure out 1, the horizon line, 2, the vanishing point, and 3, marking out the converging lines. Not in that order, whichever order is more convenient when you are doing the study. Most likely you'll be trying to find the converging lines first, or you'll find the horizon line first. It really depends on which is clear in the picture that you're using. But here we have a lot of depth that you can see. As the objects on the ground are closer to you, they're bigger. And then I also recommend making a grid. So like I did here, when I made the converging lines, I also added some more horizontal lines so that it creates a sort of grid so that you can see how all the objects are placed on top of it. It's just another example of a study. It's 2-point perspective. Pretty self-explanatory. And then same thing here. There's a box that's drawn around this figure. It's a little bit off. This line should be a little bit lower, but I wanted to include this because putting figures in perspective is also something. Like I would say putting figures in perspective can really help you understand, like putting them in a box will help you understand how to put it into perspective. It really lets you visualize the form of the figure and how it should be facing. But we'll be getting more into form in a second. Some resources that you can use to find pictures to study from for perspective. If you search up on YouTube, like walking around cities or tours, or like even like if you look up like house tours, things like that, you can get a lot of great like taking screenshots of pictures of just like streets or like interiors, and then you can do perspective practices just doing that, just making lines like I showed in the previous slides, and converging lines, the grid, the horizon line, things like that. Pinterest, just for pictures, if you just look at room, building, street, things like that. And then of course Google Maps, which I used in the previous slides. Google Maps is a great resource for this type of study. Okay, proportion. Proportion is all about paying attention to how different shapes or different forms are like related to each other. Whether that's by using mathematical like fractions like this, not fractions, but multipliers. So you can see that this jar or this jug in the back here is about like a little bit over halfway the height of this bottle. So then you draw that on the paper. It's just really like estimating, or if you want to be really precise, you can use a ruler. But yeah, proportion is really important for you to keep things realistic. And you can also, when you understand proportion, you can mess around with proportions and make really wonky shapes and things like that. For this picture here, if you wanted to, for example, recreate this picture on your own, then you could keep in mind the proportion by looking at first, you can also look at the proportion of the canvas. Like if you look at where the halfway point is of this border, you'll see it's around here, and that's where the top edge of this desk is. And then from there, you can just draw the rest of it out. So using the proportion of the canvas like that is helpful. And then if you wanted to be a little bit more precise, you can also split it into thirds, not just halves. Or you can also, if you wanted to estimate where the chair is, then you can split the desk into fractions, so into fourths here. And then we can see, okay, it's around the halfway and the 3/4 way point is where the top of the seat is. And then you can add more fractions if you want to make it more precise. Yeah, I think for figuring out proportions, doing still lifes like this, like just setting up like different objects around you and putting them next to each other, like objects of different size, that can really help you practice proportions. Yeah, I think that's really important for really depicting things realistically. Okay. All right, so for form, why is it important? Form is all about the 3D-ness of a figure. So it can be the difference between how you make something look flat versus something that looks a lot more realistically rendered. So for example, if we just take like this random shirt with a circle with NASA on it, if we just slap that circle in the dead center of this figure, then it'll look like this, and it looks fine. But if you were to really like fit it to the form of the figure, it'd be a lot more curved. The N and A would be bigger compared to the S and A, and then yeah, it fits to the form. It's a lot more realistic. It's more 3D. Same thing with the face. I can just put the eyes and the nose and the mouth dead center on the face, and it's fine, but it looks flat. But if I wanted to make it more like fitting to the form of the face, then it would be a lot more curved. This eye would be closer to this edge of the face, and then this eye would be closer to this side. Just things like that. And I feel that a really great way to practice form is doing contour exercises like this. So for example, here we have just an apple. Like if you do an outline of an apple and then you like draw these lines that go around the exterior form of it, then you can make this like cool contour figure of the apple. And just doing that not with apples but other things around you is a great way to practice seeing form and really being able to visualize 3D forms in your head as well. And then we're going to move on to figure studies, and I'll let Veronica speak on this.
Cool. So when it comes to figure studies, a lot of people are intimidated by them. So, it's like I said with the light studies, it can get really easy to get caught up in the details of things, but something that can make it a lot easier is to just figure out what you want to focus on. So are you trying to practice your anatomy? Are you trying to really nail this character interaction down? Or are you trying to like get your clothing more realistic? Those are all things that you can sort of separately focus on in your study. I try to provide some examples there. In terms of anatomy, there are a ton of online resources that you can use. Line of Action in particular is pretty helpful. It has its own built-in timers, so like you have the option to create a system that's set up like a studio to where you do the really quick time studies at the beginning, and then in increments it'll get longer and longer as your hands get more warmed up. Line of Action also has stuff for like still lifes and animals and all that cool stuff. So I highly recommend that website for online figure studies. There's also other websites, Philly and Guest Draw Party. Those are also helpful. But Winnie can speak more on those resources. Um, in terms of what you can get in person in Gainesville, one group that you could one group that you could look into is Figures on Diversity. That handles their Instagram, and their sessions, they vary depending on the semester. They're free, and they provide you with the materials, so like your boards, paper, all your drawing utensils. And then the arts and art history department also does figure drawing sessions, I believe.
Yes, actually, they are having one this Friday as well, February 2nd. If you're interested in that. Wait, yeah. They usually have it every Friday. Some Fridays they do skip because of holidays or things like that. But if you want to do figure drawings in person and on campus, they are held in Fine Arts Building D.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure if you went into Fine Arts C or something, they probably have a pin board.
Yeah, they have a poster there in Fine Arts C as well.
Yeah, there you go. Those are some resources. Also, one last thing about clothing. Just go on Pinterest and look at magazine covers. Those have some really interesting silhouettes if that's what you're looking for to help you with character design, or look at very foldy clothing. That's definitely, or interesting poses too. That's something you can help keywords to help you in your search for good reference. But yeah, okay, we can move on.
We're good. All right, so moving on to just specific aspects of figure drawing that you can focus on improving. The line of action, it's pretty simple. It's just capturing the action, the energy of a pose. So, for example, leg is towards the back, and this one's towards the front. This line's curved to capture how this body's also turned around a little bit. So we see both a little bit of their front and a little bit of their their back hair. And then just looking at how you can capture the line of action can really help you with maintaining the dynamism in a figure. Usually, I feel like if you don't look at the line of action or keep it in mind, figure drawings can turn out stiff, and just not very dynamic in general. So I wanted to include this artist because they are really great at exaggerating their figures. If you just look at this reference picture, you can see the line of action is kind of curved a little bit here, but they take it much further in their piece, so they curve it a bit more. The legs are longer to exaggerate it, and everything like that. So same thing here. They have really how do you describe it? A really strong arc of the arms here. They really have the leg just kicking outwards. It's a really strong sense of dynamism and action, so it doesn't feel like a stiff pose. Comparing it to the reference picture. Another thing is clear silhouette. Just let's look at this picture first because I feel like it's most easy to see. This person and this person, they're making the same pose. They're just drinking from a cup of water. But if you take the silhouettes of both of them, it's not as readable on the left, but a lot more readable on the right because you have a lot more of this, the negative space, and you can see the limb of the arm in the cup. You can see the cup and the liquid coming out of the cup. So clear silhouette will really help you exaggerate a pose and make it a lot more readable. And this is absolutely important in animation. But yeah, just when you're doing figure drawing studies, you can change up the pose a little bit so that it fits into a clear silhouette. So if in the case that you had like a figure that was posing like this, then you could figure a way out to extend out the arms, and so that it's a lot more readable. And then for this image, it's just showing more examples like this. This girl here, she has her arm closer to her body, so and her legs are like in front of each other, so it's not very readable compared to this one. We can really see the jolliness of her figure through like the way her arms and her legs are like more stretched out and extended. And then yeah, same thing with these figures. For this dog, the frontal pose, it's really hard to read. Like if you just look at the silhouette, if you squint your eyes and you just look at this, you can't even tell that he's holding something. You just see like a hint of his arm, but like nothing else. So the figure on the right is a lot more readable. You see, his figure. You can see the arm stretched out and the present box. Yeah.
If I could add one thing.
Oh, I'm not sure, Veronica, do you have anything to add before we move on?
Yeah. One more thing to add with the silhouette stuff. If you're trying to look for, like more specifics.
Okay, I suppose not. Moving on to composition. This will be our final fundamental. So we're almost to the end. Composition is all about guiding the eye of the viewer to what you want them to look at. So this picture is really demonstrating the rule of thirds, which you might have already heard of. It's just like this grid of 3, like separating it into thirds. You've probably also already seen like the, what is it called? The perfect. I always forget the one that looks like a shell, and it's like mathematically like perfect to create like this certain specific like composition. But like there's these types of things so that you can figure out how to place the elements in your scene. So if you wanted to put a person just on this landscape, you can use the rule of thirds so that you put this guy on this side of the piece, compared to like if you put him like over here or over here. And we say rule of thirds because it's close enough to the center where they're very visible, but they're not right at the center, which if you put a figure at the center, it can give like a sort of importance or weight to them that you might not want. So just keeping that in mind. And also, composition can also be about maintaining balance or creating asymmetry, or like making sure that's not balanced, depending on what kind of feeling you want in a piece. With balance, you're going to have a bit more like feeling of harmony and unity, and then unbalanced compositions can create like a fretful, energetic sort of a composition. Okay, moving on to certain points. Composition, I put this as the last fundamental because it really relies on a lot of the previous fundamentals we've talked about. So for example, value and color, just the contrast between these two concepts can be really useful for composition. So like we talked about before with this piece, the light here, it has a lot of value contrast, and so our eye is immediately drawn to there. So it's a really important part of composition because value and color contrast can lead our eye directly to a certain area. Another thing is eye contact in a piece. So like, for example, in this piece, it can create implied lines, which is what I mean by that is like, if you look at this person, they're looking in this way. So it creates sort of a line that's not visible, but it's there. We just subconsciously like look at where figures in a piece are looking at. So eye contact is really a really important compositional tool to use as well. Another thing I'll mention is the difference between diagonal lines versus horizontal and vertical lines. They can convey different things. So, for example, in this piece, we have horizontal lines through these waves, and it's creating this like peaceful, calm sort of feeling. And if in this piece we have more of a diagonal, like this hanging light is diagonal, this table is diagonal. If you were to imagine it like everything were like more horizontal and vertical, it'd be a lot more like calm. But because we have this diagonal sort of composition, it feels a bit more dynamic, a bit more fun. Yeah. Moving on to framing in composition, that's also important. Framing is when you're using just different elements to block out certain parts of the piece. So, for example, this house roof is blocking out this left side of the piece, and then these birds are blocking out the right side of the piece. So instantly, our view is like we look towards the center here because it's the only place that's not blocked by these foreground elements. Yeah, so you can use different elements to frame the piece, and that's how you can direct the viewer's eye to certain parts of the piece. And then some resources for composition. Honestly, you can really just study anything. Like you can study pictures, you can study different artworks by artists, you can study movie stills. So, for example, this website Film Grab, it just has a whole bunch of screenshots from a lot of movies. Not very, actually, I'm not sure. Some, I believe, is mostly just scenes. But anyways, you can just study different scenes and look at how they compose their shots to create a certain feeling. And then also this YouTube channel called Airy Frame Painting. Literally so good. This channel has so many great videos that mostly pertains to film and cinema. So if you're going more for like a storytelling route in animation, this is really useful because they talk about how you can really convey like your story through the way you compose your shots scene by scene. So yeah, Airy Frame Painting, really recommend their channel. It's really interesting. But yeah, that's it, guys. We're finally at the end. So I have compiled some pictures here, just some example pictures, and I'll also post them in the chat so that you can view them separately. But what you can do is use these pictures or use your own pictures that you find online, and then we can simultaneously just like work on studying them just studying like any sort of aspect that we've learned in this presentation. But yeah, unfortunately, since you can't, what's it called? We can't